churn is a term from business land. It's the rate at which people come into your product and then leave your product. But what we're going to be using it for is talking about the rate at which in Magic a metagame is solved. And we're going to talk about how booster packs has been and may or may not be continuing to be a solution to this problem, and sort of the pros and cons of the booster pack in general.
Distraction makers.
Why does Magic still use booster packs, right? In this day and age of loot boxes, of microtransactions, how does Magic continue to get away with distributing cards through a booster pack?
That's a great question, and one that I think many other game developers would like the answer to, because many other game developers have tried to put booster packs into their games that are not trading card games, and it has almost always gone horribly wrong.
The distribution of cards in a randomized way is part of the ecosystem of a trading card game. And we're going to talk about why that is, right? What are the benefits to both the game and the player,
right,
for this type of distribution model?
Yeah.
And why in trading card games it can be a symbiotic relationship between player and game rather than exploitative the way that loot boxes can be.
And I think that's what, I mean, the first thing to even mention that I think is very important to mention is that the reason loot boxes started being developed, I'm assuming, if I were to guess, maybe originated from the success of card games. Obviously, they could have looked at other influences of actual gambling, but obviously literal gambling as opposed to a connection of getting these pieces that are then used for gameplay, it's probably more likely they looked at trading card games. I think that it's important for us to point out that like booster packs were not developed initially with the concept of exploitation. They were developed for the actual, it was initially intended for the game to be played based off of a handful of booster packs.
When in Magic's inception, right, the beginnings of the game, booster packs have been there. And part of the reason why is because that was the means of distributing the cards, right? Richard Garfield's initial vision for Magic was that any given individual person would not have all of the game pieces of the game, and might not even have all the game pieces that they want.
On average, they said that players would spend $40.
Right. That was his like lofty pie in the sky goal. And honestly, I've seen some interviews with him now. He'll say things like, "Yeah, people spend around $40, and if they spend more than that, that's a good problem to have, right? Because that means the game is healthy. That means the game is a hit."
Yeah.
And very quickly, they realized that the game is a hit, and people are spending hundreds of dollars trying to track down the game pieces. In any kind of game, any type of business in general, you have this thing called churn, which basically means that you'll have people that come into the game, and then they'll leave.
Right.
And there's a certain amount of time that you're looking to for that player to remain in the game. And so you start looking for ways to extend that period of time that somebody plays the game for. Ideally, you're doing that in a way that is beneficial to the player. Yeah. And gives them, I talk about this concept called the player's journey a lot, which is the sort of story that the player gets to experience over their time playing a game. And I think you see this in at an individual game level, and you also see this at a player life cycle level, which is the churn that we're talking about. A player comes in, they play the game. Once they reach a certain level of satisfaction with the game or dissatisfaction with the game, they leave. The booster pack fits perfectly within that life cycle. If it takes time for players to get the objects into their hands, it will then take them time to solve the environment in which those objects exist.
Right.
And then once they do, we can be ready with another release.
Which, this was not the initial intended use of booster packs, right? Because initially the intended use was just trying to make a game that is not even necessarily not solvable, but a game that is asymmetrical, in that you could go and discover some card that you haven't seen before from someone else, right? Someone else gets this rare thing. That's why they had, the Power 9, right? And then later on, as the game obviously became a hit, and they started having more organized play, and they realized, okay, well, if suddenly everyone is getting all these big cards and the game is becoming solvable, how do we make it so that the game is not in this solvable state, right? They wanted to keep creating more content for it. So booster packs ended up sort of becoming that way as well. And it was necessary to push that meta life cycle out further.
Right. And it's sort of a way to bring like the variance that is in the gameplay of Magic. You're bringing that variance into the act of collecting your game pieces to get to the point where you even have the pieces to play with.
Right.
And it's interesting. I think we could get some criticism here from players saying, well, I want to just have the game pieces. I want to be able to play the game in the way that I want to play it.
Which there are games that attempted this as well. Netrunner, also Richard Garfield, did this.
With the amount of data, with you being able to immediately know all the cards in the set, the argument of this extends the meta life cycle of a game.
It doesn't. That no longer fits this argument.
I
what
think
booster packs fit is it fits draft and it fits casual audience and collectors.
I think in the same way that when the game initially was released, right, when Magic first came out and Richard's idea was no one person is going to have the same collection, no one person is going to have tons of copies of the same cards.
Right.
We're going to have this environment in which you're constantly experiencing new things. That wasn't the inception of Magic happened before the internet, like before the internet was popular.
I was going to ask you if you remember, because you started playing around, obviously the internet was around when you started playing,
right?
But it was still earlier on. How long, if you remember, was roughly the meta life cycle? Not the cycle between sets and set rotations, but like how long did it take? Because now we just discussed that when I'm on Magic Arena, it takes 1 week, right? 2 weeks before I start seeing the meta really just start come into place.
I'm trying to remember how I ended up getting deck lists because I got tournament level deck lists at that point, and I'm pretty sure it was just from forums. It was just from people talking.
Forums, and then the Magic's magazine or whatever probably had some stuff on there.
And I never really was into the magazine. It was mainly forums, and I'm pretty sure there was some tournament results at that point, but they were very, very rare.
Right.
Where now it's a set every month, and the set gets like people are almost solving the meta before the set even comes out.
Right.
You have access to all the cards. You have access to tons of data in terms of what Magic, sort of falls off of Magic Arena or Magic Online, where you have daily tournament reports of multiple tournaments. And I think that we may have reached a point here where the booster pack is not enough in terms of managing player churn rates. In that, like we talked about, Richard Garfield's initial idea is no player ends up with the same cards. Okay, well then we fast forward a little bit more, which is sort of Scaff Elias's vision of Magic and how the booster fits in, which we see from the GDC talk, which I think the video was posted in like 2011.
Yeah.
So it's been even over 10 years since that talk was even posted. I don't know when the talk was recorded.
Right.
Where now we've entered this era of big data. There's tons of data all over the place. Metas are solved within a week in terms of even the booster draft environment. And so when one of the things that Scaff Elias talks about is a meta's churn rate, right? Which is the set is released, you see the uptick in players collecting the cards, brainstorming, trying to get the meta figured out. There's sort of a peak where the meta is solved and it starts to stagnate.
Yep.
And then there's a fall off, right? That's the churn. Players start leaving.
Yep.
And then they're sort of timing that with a new set release, sort of right as it starts to go down. And so when we're seeing these new sets come out once a month, I think that's pretty close to what the churn rate is.
They're probably following that, right? Which, we mentioned if metas are being solved within 2 weeks, right? And then it starts to dip at that point, maybe 2 to 3 weeks, right? It's probably 2 weeks solved, 1 week of play, and then, 1 week down. Are sets coming out once a month?
Set a month is basically where we're at. Wow. And I think it's because they're following this churn rate, right? They're seeing the uptick. Honestly, they're probably looking at player numbers on Arena.
Yeah, probably.
And so what I'm wondering is that if at this point, I think booster packs are here to stay, obviously,
Right.
and I think the elongation of the meta life cycle is important here.
Yeah.
And that boosters play a particularly good role in it. But I think we're going to need
more.
More.
Yeah.
I think we're going to, and we can see Alchemy on Magic Arena, so they're tweaking stuff in between to try to keep that player churn down.
Yeah. We're questioning the validity based off of what the original intention was of booster packs, right?
Yeah.
Are they still valid for that purpose? And because of the amount of data, what we're saying is no. Like, it's not really valid. How much does it really extend the meta cycle? And probably by nothing, because when you look at Arena, what's it cost to draft, right? It's roughly $2 per pack on Arena, I think, something like that. Maybe $3. And you draft for, $20 or whatever. And in the first week, you do the pre-release draft. You're seeing most of the cards. You're seeing decks constructed in the draft format. That's going to then, inform what the next, what the archetypes are or whatever, how people are going to theory craft. Also, there's tons of online things now. And if they have a database where they upload cards, then you can start testing it there. You don't even have to buy like the packs to even start testing.
And then you just buy the singles.
And then you just buy the singles.
Yeah.
And so
that's been a pattern for a long time in terms of but the efficiency at which metas are being solved now is way higher than what it has ever been.
Right. But so now if we start considering, okay, if booster packs aren't necessarily the most viable way of extending a meta cycle, but extending a meta cycle is going to be good for the health of the game, because any other trading card game that comes out right now, like, they can't come out with a set a month. They don't have the profitability that Magic has. So how do these other games extend cycles?
Right.
Marvel Snap had an interesting solution by extending the actual collection process. Look, it was a solution. And I think it worked for a while.
I do think that is what they were attempting to do, right? Is figure out how to solve this problem, right? Where how do we and the thing that I want to really touch on here is how a designer can extend the life cycle of their game and make sure that players don't drop off while also benefiting the player, right?
Yeah.
And I do think that there was a point in time where booster packs did that.
Yeah.
Where it was a mutually beneficial relationship between the game and the player that, hey, booster packs are fair. They extend the meta life cycle. I think that time has probably passed in terms of getting cards into players' hands.
Yeah.
And the secondary market has a lot to do with that. But I think at this point, like you mentioned, there's these websites that people are going to and building decks and having access to the cards immediately in terms of experimentation and then getting to the point. One counter argument here is that there are still decks that come out of nowhere.
Yeah.
At the most recent Pro Tour, we had, I think it's the most recent at this point, we had a vampire deck.
That's two Pro Tours. No, never mind. I'm thinking of the qualifier. Yeah, okay. I think it was the most recent Pro Tour. Rakdos Vampires.
Yeah, we had like a vampire deck kind of come out of nowhere, and nobody expected it.
Yeah.
And it disrupted everything. Maybe the part of this is that the data that we're getting in terms of how solved a meta is actually isn't reality. That's part of it. It's more consensus rather than truth.
It very well could be that it's just a large amount of people that are seeing these decks that are constructed and doing well that are just all dogpiling.
Right.
Therefore, it seems like that is the strongest thing because people aren't exploring and experimenting.
Right. And that's like a really interesting point, because whether it's true meta solve or not, I think almost doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's perception.
Yeah.
It's if players perceive that the metagame has been solved and it is stagnant, you're going to hit the plateau as players dogpile the deck that's best, or the few decks that are best, hopefully. And then you're going to get a plateau of period of time, and then you're going to see players start dropping off.
Yeah.
And that's sort of like what we're combating here is how do we extend that period of time before you hit the plateau? And is the booster distribution model even, maybe it's a piece of the puzzle still?
Possibly. So now let's discuss other possible solutions, because you mentioned what's technically I think referred to as a living card game, right? Like Netrunner.
Yeah.
And that's where it's all packaged, right? Yeah. Now those metas solved very quickly. At least more quickly, probably, I would assume, than Magic was back in the day. But now you're seeing other games that have been developed that have experimented with other ways of trying to extend this meta life cycle. Right. Coincidentally, again, mostly designed by Richard Garfield. He's got a vendetta for this, I think. But so we talked about Artifact on the channel. And Artifact, we discussed, probably tries to solve this in a different way in that it decides to have a very similar model where you have booster packs. You actually also have a secondary market, and you can buy and sell whatever cards you want. But in order to keep the game feeling fresh as far as gameplay goes, is it has a lot more variance in the game itself. Marvel Snap technically does this as well by having locations that adds a little bit more variance and variety to the gameplay itself.
Right.
The problem with that is very hit or miss for some players. And so it doesn't necessarily extend the meta as much as it creates that feeling of unsolvability in a game.
Right.
Which can be good, but also alienating to casual players.
Oh, I think it's the opposite. I think it's alienating to...
Sorry. Marvel Snap, great for casual players.
Yep.
Artifact, alienating to casual players.
Which is really interesting because, that like the Marvel Snap versus Artifact thing.
I think they're both trying to solve the same thing.
Right.
Different routes and
Right.
Yeah, players took it differently.
Part of the reason why you as a player should want a game that is attempting to extend this meta cycle as long as possible is because it keeps things interesting for a much longer period of time.
Right.
I think that developing a system that doesn't artificially extend this, I think booster packs, that's the argument, are booster packs artificially extending this meta life cycle. You as a player are going to have longer to experiment. You're going to have more people to play against, and more decks that are viable for a longer period of time, as long as this can be extended, right? Yep. And I think that it's also good for the game because the game, again, the more players playing the game, the better the game is doing.
Well, we discussed that trading card games, why we find them so interesting is because they're like two games, right? You have the deck construction and the whole meta construction.
Like three games, yeah.
Right. And then you've got the actual gameplay itself, which is also very deep most of the time for most games. And so to have that deck construction, once it's solved, it's like removing half the game, right? Yeah. Because at that point, okay, red Shine Greymon deck. I'm referencing Digimon because I don't know Magic.
You could just be that guy. It's fine.
Yeah, I know. I'll be that guy. Shine Greymon's top deck. Everyone just plays mono red, and that's it. It's like number one at the tournaments, right? And like you could look at these other decks, you could get counter decks, and we could talk about, healthiness of what it makes a healthy meta and stuff like that. But generally, once you start seeing those decks there, like if you go to a tournament, you're going to be seeing one of 3 to 5 decks.
Right. So the important thing to touch on here from a player's perspective is that half of the game of Magic is playing the game and then going and changing your strategy.
Right.
And that's the two halves of the game, right? It's playing the game and it's deck building.
Yeah.
It's tactics and it's strategy. And once a meta is solved, that strategy part becomes super narrow, right? Where, okay, well, these are just the decks, and there's a few slots that can be sort of flex slots. But other than that, the deck's done. This is what the deck does. This is how it plays. And that's it.
And it doesn't mean that the tactics part isn't still super engaging.
It's that the focus becomes on the tactics part, which is the part that becomes a race to the top, right?
Right.
It's that Magic still is a very high skill game. There's a lot of variance within the gameplay, but as more games are played, those players that are getting better and better start being filtered to the top, and players that are not as good start dropping off.
Yeah.
And that is the cycle that you see repeated again and again in games that do not have enough variance and are not doing enough to extend this life cycle.
Right. So getting back, to how do you extend this in other ways? What's the future of this? Because I don't think the future is booster packs.
How do you minimize churn?
And I think KeyForge did a very interesting thing with this. So KeyForge, the way that it works is instead of getting booster packs, you actually get booster decks, basically. You get a deck, and it is algorithmically unique. It has a unique card back, a unique name. No one else will have that card back. No one else will have that name.
And you cannot mix decks together.
Can't customize it.
You buy the deck, that's the deck.
There is like a player-driven fan format where you can mix decks and stuff. That goes against the entire spirit of the game itself, which I think is kind of wild. Yeah. But great, like people can do that. So how this gets around it by having a completely unique algorithm that generates this deck is that you don't know what the top deck is.
Right.
And it has a really interesting tournament system where you play that deck and can see how many times you have won consecutively.
And decks will be retired eventually, right?
Right.
Yeah. So keep the churn on the game end, the good stuff, turning over.
But in the way that we just discussed that TCGs generally are tactics and strategy, this is all tactics. You technically have a strategy in that you should understand your deck.
Your strategy is buy a bunch of decks till you get a good one.
Right, yeah.
Which is one of the drawbacks. Yeah. The other drawback, I think, is that player identity in deck construction is a huge deal.
Yeah.
And it eliminates that completely, which I think is a huge bummer.
Yeah. Oh.
What's up?
She's never done this. Why is she doing this now?
She wants attention.
I guess.
Oh, yeah, so cute. Oh, yeah.
This is how we'll get the views.
Yeah. I mean, people have been asking for it. So.
I know.
Oh, where are you going?
She doesn't
Where
know.
are you headed?
She's trying to drink.
Don't drink my water. Get out of there. Oh.
Phasma, go. Get out of here.
Coming here? All right. Any rate.
So, KeyForge, I think it does seem to gravitate towards people that maybe like any sort of tournament play or draft boost play in that way. And I think that it is probably, it's like best suited for that type of gameplay, right? So like we're saying that you are missing out in this other demographic, or you're missing out in this possibility of you having ownership over your deck and stuff. It's offering a very specific type of gameplay that is suited for a certain type of TCG player.
Yes.
But it's not completely giving, it's not solving everything, right?
Well, and the sort of solvability and deck construction part of this is it's funny because are we just chilling there? Okay, cool.
All right.
That's just what's happening. So they're almost like opposing forces, right? Like you want to be able to build the deck that you want to build, but if you're able to do that, that's part of what's solving the gameplay.
Yeah.
And so, TCGs obviously continue to put out new cards, and that can again reinvigorate that strategy half of what's going on. But like, yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm at a crossroads here in terms of what's the right way to handle this. One way I think is really interesting is that is if we look at Warhammer, right? So Warhammer could, and some miniature games are distributed similar to booster packs. You have like a mystery box distribution or whatever So this is a distribution model that's possible. But if we look at the way Warhammer does it, you buy exactly the units for your army, and then they have a codex that explains how many points each of those models are worth, and that's how you get this meta.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is you can change that outside of the game pieces, right? The codex exists on its own, and you can update that whenever and however you want to.
It's kind of like a digital game where you can update mana costs, you can update stats.
Right.
Yeah.
You can change the types of equipment that the army can equip, everything like that, and then you can rebalance things without having to errata cards or ban units or whatever.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting, and I think there's some space there that could be explored.
Yeah. I think it's you either have that where you can create a fresh meta, and this is how a lot of digital games, collectible games do this, is that, the meta is ever changing because there's balance patches, there's updates, right? And suddenly, now this card costs 2 more, so that's dead, and that kills this entire deck archetype or whatever, because it was all relying on that card.
Well, and that will happen in Warhammer too, by the way. Like you'll have these instances where somebody has built an army and they've spent $500
More
than that.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
And they've spent time painting those units.
Uh-huh.
And that's the other thing that's interesting here too, is that the game pieces are, in Warhammer are so much more, or
you
even
have
more
so
personal.
much,
You're,
customizability.
you're personalizing the models and you're painting them and
That investment is that's why I'll never get into it. It's insane.
It's really cool.
I'm sure it is.
Yeah, I mean, I had a whole Tyranids army that I painted, and I mean that's like 300 models. I painted all of them, modified half of them.
No.
And then I sold it, and I wish I hadn't, but I wasn't playing the game at all. Most of the gameplay for me was painting the models.
You don't say.
Yeah.
So I think that, right, you can have this sort of secondary thing that you're able to update. It's unique for a physical game to have that, like Warhammer, but most of the time that's limited to digital games. Or it's like we were talking about. You go the Marvel Snap / Artifact route, and you have more variance in the gameplay itself. So even if the meta is solved, it still keeps the game fresh.
Right.
That's a possibility. Or Marvel Snap also has like different tiers where there's separate metas depending on what tier you're at, which is also interesting. Or you end up having the other route where you try to have some sort of variance in how you're actually collecting the cards that is restricted.
Right.
So that players have to play with something that isn't the most optimized,
they
optimal
just
way of
can't
playing
get a
because they
hold of
can't
the
do
thing.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I think is interesting. And I think what's most interesting is that digital is like the best place to do something like that.
Yeah.
And I'm surprised that no one has done that yet.
Right. That would be something very interesting.
Yeah.
And even the Warhammer solution that I'm talking about,
Digital would handle that way
Digital would
better.
handle it extremely well.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we'll see. I don't know. Just thoughts.
All right, Phasma, you're getting kicked off.
Come on. Yeah, it was cute.
You're too distracting.